Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses for their excellent testimony. I've been watching this hearing, really important hearing. I'm just back from Taiwan and Korea, actually. And I will tell you, there's nothing like being in a country, two places where if it weren't for the sacrifice of America's military over decades, you wouldn't have these free, prosperous, thriving democracies. It makes you very proud as an American citizen to see that. Mr. Pottinger, I want to commend you on your Wall Street Journal op-ed, Beijing Targets American Business from March 26th. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this for the record.
Without objection.
So one thing that I want to address to you, Mr. Pottinger, many people, when you read the Financial Times and others, there's this narrative of the inevitable rise of China with regard to power, economics, the military. But you all have already, in your testimony today, talked about how this could, particularly on the econ side, stall out. And you've emphasized smart capital, intellectual property. Can you briefly just mention that a little bit more detail, and then I want to go into some of these finance concerns.
Yeah, Senator, of course. One of the things that I was struck by over my time working on the NSC staff was the degree to which China is frightened of losing access to American know-how, as well as capital, and, and especially smart capital, like Silicon Valley venture capital that provides both the know-how and the money. And in fact, if you look at China's tech sector, virtually every single major player, at least in the software space, was funded by Silicon Valley, and the software engineers were trained in the United States. So the idea that China is inexorably going to continue to rise, that they've cracked the code, even though they have enormous talent, there's no denying the incredible pools of talent and industriousness and entrepreneurship of Chinese people, the system does not reward that, and decreasingly so. It is less and less rewarding to work in those sectors because the party fears those entrepreneurs and those sectors challenging party authority. So they're actually, I think that without the benefit of American know-how and smart capital, you would see a stalling out of what appears to be a miracle.
Good. Let me dig into that, and it's really troubling. The more you mentioned smart capital, the more that I dig into this. Senior Democrats in the Biden administration, senior Republicans from the Trump administration have all mentioned to me with alarm this issue of American financiers, private equity, big banks. They mention Sequoia Capital all the time, BlackRock. These are Americans who've gotten super rich. You know, we're a capitalistic society, but they knowingly are financing our competitor, the PLA, AI. They've funded the rise of China. This is a concern I'm hearing about all the time. Can you talk about these firms, others, and what we should do to stop it? China doesn't have this problem. They don't have billionaire Chinese funding us, but we have this problem. And I'm going to start naming names. It's unpatriotic. It's a real problem. I'm hearing it from Democrats and Republicans. Can you unpack that a little bit more? How damaging are these American companies to American interests?
Senator, I do think that that trend of growing flows of capital, and I think there's both dumb money and smart money, but both of them are very useful.
I wouldn't call money smart if it's, maybe these guys are going to get rich, but I don't think it's smart if it's funding our chief adversary globally.
I think it's one of our most potent advantages that we are not actually.
How do we stop these American financiers from funding the Communist Party of China?
I think that congressional oversight of the Treasury Department, hard oversight, riding them hard to expand, like I said, by orders of magnitude, the blacklist of companies that Americans are allowed to invest in China is one. I think we should be looking at a CFIUS-like body for outbound investment so that we screen outbound American investment headed towards China to make sure that it's not damaging our national interest and national security. Those are the two ideas.
Let me ask one final question. You know, a lot of this hearing has talked about American comparative advantages. I think that's always an important area of focus. We've talked about allies, freedom, certainly, the rule of law. But let me give one other question for you. Energy. We are now the world's energy superpower. We're energy independent. We produce more natural gas, more oil, more renewables than any country on the planet Earth. We've been seeking that energy independence in a bipartisan way for decades. We're now there. China, I believe, fears this tremendously. We now have an administration that actually is looking to restrict the production of American energy. Every time John Kerry goes to another country and says, we're going to restrict production of American energy, you should restrict your production of energy too, Korea, Taiwan. It's crazy. How big of a comparative advantage is American energy independence relative to China? And do you think, like I do, that this administration's policy of unilaterally disarming this enormous comparative advantage is strategic insanity?
Well, the second half of the 20th century, all of the wars that we got involved in the Middle East are in one way or another tied to America trying to protect its energy supplies and energy security. So the fact that we have actually achieved energy independence is a godsend. It is something that gives us far more options, allows us to avoid getting entangled into conflicts in parts of the world that we don't want to be in conflict in. And to that extent, I think that whatever approach we take in trying to greenify the economy, first has to take into account the fact that gas is a lot cleaner than it's given credit for. But second, that we don't want to end up in a position where we're suddenly making China the new Saudi Arabia because we're depending on their supply chains to provide us with, for example, batteries for our cars. So if we're going to go to all-electric vehicles, we're going to have a pretty tough-minded policy of tariffs as well as subsidies that are designed to actually bring that entire supply chain back to the United States. It's not an easy thing to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.